to the remote podcast edition of First Name Basis. Here we chat with special guests, industry leaders, and TribalScale employees to have an authentic but informal conversation on things about relevant to tech and innovation. I'm Alfie, Tham, the Director of Engineering here at TribalScale, and I'm chatting remotely with Pearlyn Ng, Research and Knowledge Lead at the Canadian Mental Health Association. How are you doing?
Good. Well, I mean, as good as any of us can be, given the current COVID-19 situation. Thanks for having me here.
Let's jump into what we're going to talk about today. So it's mental health and well-being in tech. So I think you will cover the mental health and well-being this, and I'm just going to be the tech guy, and it'll be an interesting conversation. I mean we've known each other for a while now, and every time I talk to you, I learn a whole bunch about the space. So the way it will work is, in preparation for this, I sent out a survey to colleagues, and they forwarded on to their colleagues in other companies, other places within tech, and so they've like a lot of good questions has come in from the community, and so yeah, there's that to go through, and I'm sure there's a bunch that you can share as well. So maybe the way we'll do this is we'll tackle some of the questions, and then naturally it will unfold as a conversation, and we'll start inserting your tidbits and your smartness in this, things that people can take away and sort of helps either see things differently or like help us know what we don't know, and then we can sort of explore further and things like that. That sounds good.
Yeah, I think that's great. It's always good to have questions from the wider community. We gotta give the people what they want.
Yeah, it's also so good diversity of perspectives here. So I think one of the most common things I see is that obviously people are thinking about COVID, and that's everyone's talking about what COVID is. So I mean, what else is on everyone else's mind? So yeah, like it's caused a lot of stress, a lot of uncertainty, anxiety. I'm not sure what you want to call that, but it's definitely making people feel not great. I guess maybe I'll ask it as a how should we process this? How should we think about this? Like, when being in this lockdown, it feels different.
I absolutely agree with you in that it's not normal. Funny thing is that while you were saying, these are unprecedented times, I was thinking of a joke that I saw the other day, in that so many news outlets and social media sites are kind of prefacing everything they say with, these are unprecedented times. So, drink every time you hear that. You're really, really drunk at this point.
I might have subconsciously brought that into it. It's just, yeah.
No, but the thing is, these are unprecedented times, and I just want to acknowledge that the way we're feeling is unprecedented. We're feeling uncertainty, we're feeling stress, we're feeling anxiety, and we're feeling this discomfort is the best way that perhaps we can describe it. There was a really interesting article that came out in the Harvard Business Review. It's called "This Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." Mm-hmm. So the COVID-19 pandemic is forcing many of us to change the way that we go about our daily lives. With those changes, some of us are experiencing a wave of losses, whether it's economic, social, physical, or emotional. And for some, these losses may build up and lead to feelings of grief. Mm-hmm. So we talk about grief. I think it could come as a surprise to realize that grief can be things other than reactions to events like death. And such emotional reactions can include shock, numbness, denial, anger, fear, anxiety, panic. So all of these are kind of these familiar emotions that we're feeling right now. In linking our feelings of loss to grief, it's also kind of helpful to have an understanding of the different types of grief. So in the current situation that we're facing right now, there's maybe ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief. So ambiguous grief refers to a loss that occurs without the opportunity to say goodbye, such as engaging in the kinds of traditional rituals and obtaining closure, even making unresolved feelings commonplace. And I think the rapidness of change during this pandemic has caused many of us to be left with a real sense of unease. the losses we're experiencing are not typically acknowledged as a loss by our families and friends. So like losing our confidence in the future, losing our security in our career plans, losing our feelings of control over our own lives, all of these are losses that we may grieve, but we don't have the rituals or even language in place to acknowledge them as grief, because we think about grief as, you know, someone that I know has passed away, and it's often this very, very heavy thing. Now the other
That's interesting. Let's unpack this a little bit. So it's ambiguous grief. Another point is it's a loss. It's having loss and not being able to have proper closure on that loss. Is that the essence of what this grief is about?
Exactly. You know, even just thinking about that term ambiguous, right? It's hard because it's difficult to define. And when you try to communicate it to a friend or a loved one that, hey, I'm feeling this grief because, and then you have no language to describe because what? Why do I feel this way? Why am I feeling this heavy feeling in my chest? And, you know, it's not like someone I know has passed away. It's not like it's not like something deeply traumatic has happened to me. That's what people might be feeling, in that I feel this way and there's no quantitative reason that I can define why, other than, you know, the whole world's on fire and the pandemic's going on outside. But
no, and people, so people might people who don't understand this might be associating it to anything else, right? So like maybe, oh, like I'm feeling this way because, I mean, the most obvious thing to point the finger at is like, yeah, like because the world's on fire, or but it could, I can imagine how it could be detrimental where let's say like, oh, I'm feeling like this and I'm associating it with my coworker who is or a family member who is whom I'm seeing a lot these days. It could be that. But yeah, it's interesting to think of it this way. So it being the lack of closure, and then and that tie into your second point in that we can grieve different kinds of losses. It's not just about, let's say, like a death of someone. In this case, I think what you mentioned there is losing in now, like I think you mentioned losing in security and confidence about the future.
mm-hmm.
So you mentioned, okay, so that's an interesting way to think about it. So that is a loss, and therefore there's grief, and because there is no closure and not a way to be acknowledged. Is that it?
Yeah. So the whole concept of ambiguous grief revolves around this idea of it just being incredibly hard to define and hard to communicate about why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. So the other kind of grief that we could be seeing in this situation is anticipatory grief, which refers to our feelings of grief that happen even before a loss occurs. So, for example, we may be worrying about a very ill family member and already feel that we're grieving them. Or we could be anticipating a loss of income and financial insecurity. Even though
that's the one that ties to the COVID situation.
Exactly. And even though our worst fears may not come to pass, anticipating them can lead to legitimate feelings of grief because we sense that something bad is coming, even if we can't quantify it. And that breaks our feeling of safety and stability.
Mm-hmm. So how would you say is a good way to deal with that?
How do we combat it? Yeah. So the first thing is to, well, actually, it's not necessarily the first thing, because you can do this in really any sequence, but I think a big part of it is in recognizing it and naming it for what it is. Because in naming our feelings as grief, we can then begin to understand the underlying emotions it brings, and then you can address them. And then you recognize that the emotions you feel are not right or wrong, but we do need to recognize that we will experience these feelings of anger, denial, frustration, and that you need to pass and feel the depths of your pain in order to work through your grief. And the second part of that is invalidating your feelings. And this is one that can be quite interesting, particularly if you're surrounded by other people who have experienced varying degrees of loss in their lives. So for example, let's say your job is secure, you're financially secure, you don't know anybody in your life that you're close to who has fallen ill in the pandemic, and yet you're feeling like you're struggling, or you're feeling this sense of loss and grief, and that is still a perfectly legitimate way to feel. I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that we are trying to live and work in a global emergency. So the way that you feel, even if you're not, say, affected to it as much as some other people, objectively speaking, because let's say you have a friend who has, lost their job, lost a loved one, maybe they've lost their home even, and you might feel, when you think about your own feelings, well, how can I feel this way when somebody else is struggling with so much more? And so how can I justify my feelings? Well, that's kind of a zero-sum game. Your emotions don't nullify somebody else's emotions, and their struggles don't nullify yours. Those are two completely separate things. So suppressing your feelings or feeling guilty for having them doesn't allow you to take the steps to resolve them.
Correct me if I'm wrong, like the point here is that no matter what it is, if that's what you're feeling, that is a valid feeling.
Exactly. And I think that sometimes when these kinds of very uncertain or chaotic situations occur, there can be a bit of a one-upmanship of struggle that, my struggling is larger than yours, so you're not allowed to speak, or you're not allowed to voice your feelings because mine are bigger than yours, or vice versa, right? Where it becomes, because I am affected more than you, your feelings are not valid. But that is not true at all. Like, everybody's feelings in this situation are absolutely valid, that you're struggling because you're struggling, and that is okay.
So now this gets into interpersonal as well. So the other point is like recognizing it for yourself. But yeah, I think that's a good point too. Like if someone has the tendency to want to one up someone because they feel like they have like their struggles are greater than others, or that other people's struggles are not as great as someone else's that they know, like what would you say to that?
I think so, approaching from the perspective, let's say, of, you are the person who somebody else is telling you that your feelings are not valid. I think the one part of that is in recognizing why that person might be feeling that way. And so it requires, some level of empathy in that they're struggling too, and as a result having all this anger and this frustration, and a lot of that is anxiety as well. So it may be coming out in a way that feels like it's personally attacking you, but it's probably coming from a place where they themselves are feeling very scared, very vulnerable, and very anxious. And that actually brings me to the third point of what we can do in this situation of how to deal with that grief, and it's in checking your thoughts and breaking the cycle. So a big part of anticipatory grief especially is essentially these feelings of anxiety. So for example, you might be having thoughts such as, I am going to die, or there's nothing I can do, or I won't be able to cope. And these thoughts can be so strong that you believe them to be true. But not all our thoughts are facts, and many of them are simply beliefs that we hold. So here's a simple, well, I say simple, it's not that simple, but here's a thought exercise from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health that you can try. So start with catching your thoughts. When you're feeling anxious or stressed, stop and write down what you're feeling. There may be more than one thought going through your mind when you're feeling anxious, but once you've identified the thought, challenge it. Ask yourself, is this thought true? How do I know it's true? Is it 100% true and always true? What's the evidence for this thought? What is the evidence against this thought? Has the thing I'm worried about ever happened before? What actually happened? How did I cope? What was the end result? And now, if you find it hard to let go of worrying, ask yourself finally, what does worrying do for me? Is worrying actually helping me solve a problem, or is it keeping me stuck in feeling anxious? You ask yourself, how helpful is it to keep thinking this way? And after working through these approaches, see if you can come up with a more balanced thought. So for example, you might be thinking, I am elderly, and so many older people are getting extremely ill. I could die from this. But that can be replaced instead with the thought, I am elderly, but I'm also taking all of the recommended precautions. I have a good support network, and I'm taking steps to stay healthy. So I am likely to get through this and be fine.
Okay, I understand. That's quite a thoughtful. So to anyone watching this that's the cue for pro tip over here. If you missed it, you gotta rewind it, listen to it again. Pro tips. so so it's how to catch yourself, and so yeah.
Yeah. So the whole point of that exercise is to break the cycle of negative thought patterns that you might be having, and in challenging your own assumptions or challenging, well, why is it that I feel the way that I feel? Why do I have this assumption? Is it reasonable? And it's kind of just to be able to play devil's advocate with yourself in order to lead to a more balanced way of thinking.
Right. Okay. I like how you described it there. Like the to break the negative thought patterns. That's why we're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess and what you're saying there, that's the how.
Yes.
Question it, write it down. We spent quite a bit of time on COVID-19. If you have any other thoughts about it before we get on to other topics, there are actually a bunch of questions that are more around general mental health and well-being, and not specifically on COVID too. Next.
Yeah, sure. We can move on.
Sure. So this one is I noticed as a pattern around like what is mental health. I guess trying to understand what what mental health is, that what is an issue, what is not. But overall, I think the theme here is that it sounds like there's some questions around measuring that too.
Yeah, I almost feel like we kind of jump straight into it without actually stepping back and taking kind of a bird's eye view about, well, what is mental health anyway?
Yeah.
So let's kind of get back onto the ground and go back to your basic building blocks. Mental health is more than the absence of a mental health condition or illness. It's a positive sense of well-being, or kind of the capacity to enjoy life and deal with the challenges you face. And I think that oftentimes mental health gets confused with mental illness, in that I think people think that you just move on the spectrum of, either you're mentally healthy or you're mentally ill. But that perhaps used to be the definition that was very commonplace a while back. But nowadays we kind of use a dual continuum model. That's the official model that we kind of work with. So what does this model look like? I want you to imagine a chart that has 4 quadrants. Okay, so on the horizontal axis is mental illness, and it goes from the left to the right as high mental illness to low mental illness. And then on the vertical axis is mental health, and that goes from the bottom to the top as poor mental health or negative mental health to positive mental health. So in these 4 quadrants, kind of lifting my arm so you can actually see the 4 quadrants on the screen. So in these 4 quadrants, which the horizontal and vertical axis kind of bisect each other at the center, we might have somebody who describes himself in the bottom left. At least this is my bottom left. I don't know if it's mirrored on screen. But in that, sorry?
So that's low.
So that's bottom left. This is the bottom left quadrant.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. And so that is low mental illness and low mental health. Mm-hmm. So somebody who's in that quadrant could look like this. They could be in a state of loss because something happened in their life, or experiencing stress, but there is the absence of any symptoms of a mental health disorder. So to explain it in a different way, mental illness on the horizontal axis is described as a disturbance in thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that are severe enough to affect day-to-day functioning. So some examples are anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, and mood disorders such as major depression disorder and bipolar disorder. Now, mental health, on the other hand, the vertical axis, is a state of well-being, and we all have mental health. Just like we each have a state of physical health, we also have our own mental health to look after. So it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. It's enjoying life, having a sense of purpose.
Yeah, I think people often see it as an issue and it needs to be dealt with, and once it's dealt with, then it goes away. Well, mm-hmm. so it sounds like what you're saying there is that I guess I like that you put it side by side with physical health. So it's like
exactly
it's there, and and you want to, and it's not just to make problems go away; it's to help you try. I like that point.
Exactly, because if you think about how we think about physical health, you wouldn't expect to never be physically active and yet be extremely physically fit. That's just simply not how it works. So the same thing applies to mental health, that it's something that we need to work on, we need to care for in order to be mentally fit, so to speak. So, if you're interested in kind of like measuring that mental health aspect of what does positive mental health look like, if you look at CMHA, Canadian Mental Health Association, mental health meter, you're going to find a very short measurement tool that could help you paint kind of just a rudimentary picture of your mental health. Now, of course, that isn't in any way a substitute for professional help or advice, so don't self-diagnose if you feel like you're struggling. So, if you use the tool and it says that, your mental health might be on the poor end of the scale, do seek professional help, go to see a counselor, don't internalize it and self-diagnose. But I digress. So the point is, even if you don't have a mental illness, that doesn't mean that you're going to feel great all the time. Because you might experience stress or a difficult life event, burnout. Just like anyone can catch a cold or a flu, anyone can experience the ebbs and flows of well-being. So to reference the popular statistic of 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health problem in a year, because that's a pretty, it's a pretty common statistic. But the thing is, there's not just the 1 in 5 who have mental illness and then the rest of us who don't. There is no rest of us. There's just us, all 5 in 5, because anyone can have positive or negative mental health. We're all on the same team.
Because if I remember correctly, every time that statistic is posted, even though they have this visual of like 5 people icons and one of them is highlighted, it's actually, and the text usually says, and this is just from my memory, so let me know, and it's usually at any single point in time 1 in 5, right?
Yeah, so it is, I believe the statistic is in any given year, 1 in 5 Canadians will experience a mental health problem in that year. Right. And that's just, something that came out of the Mental Health Commission of Canada. They did a massive study around this, and the data is extremely valid. But I think it's just that we need to remember that 1 in 5 or the 4 in 5 isn't the same person that entire year.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the chart that you're saying, that is those two variables as being separate. I think that's a helpful mental model as a way to think about this. So,
yeah, and they're separate, although they do interact. So one really good example would be, say someone does struggle with a diagnosed mental illness. So let's say someone is struggling with depression, and then let's say they're currently at this point on that low mental illness. So, they're not really struggling to deal with their depression. It's mostly under control. It's not interfering with their life. However, maybe something really traumatic happens in their life. Maybe they lose a loved one. That could push their mental health to become really low. And because the mental health is really low, that could exacerbate the mental illness, so that now you have low mental health and high mental illness.
Right. Okay.
So while it is on 2 different axes, it does interact with each other.
Mm-hmm. So bringing it back to tech heuristic, that tech startups, usually if tech startups are being bootstrapped, contrasting that with the idea that obviously this is important, but if you're talking to investors, let's say you wanna if let's say they are scrutinizing your balance sheet and they say why are you spending such and such amounts in mental health, how can we as tech entrepreneurs defend that, right, from a perspective like that?
Mm-hmm. So I always love answering this question because I find it quite funny. Okay. So let me just do my spiel, and then you'll recognize why. So really the question here is that, well, why should businesses and organizations care about their employees' mental health, right? Essentially, that's the question, I think. And I can give you 3 reasons for why they should. Some are better than the other, well, depending on your perspective, right? Whether you're the business or the employee. Okay, so the first reason is, of course, the ethical approach. And that is, organizations should care because ethical workplaces that strive to build positive organizational culture will prioritize employee well-being. No, but we're just talking about ethical right now. We're just talking about pure ethics. We live in a wonderful world where everyone cares for each other, and like your boss really values you as a human being and not just for your productivity. So in this really beautiful ethical world, yeah, organizations should care about their employees fundamentally, right? So that's the ethical argument. The second argument is organizations should care because it's illegal not to. So one of the things that comes up quite often is that employees are afraid that they'll get fired or discriminated against if they go to their supervisor and say, so I'm struggling with depression right now, and there are some things that I can't handle around the office because of my depression, and then they're afraid that as a result they'll get them fired. So first of all, we're very lucky to be living in a very progressive country and a progressive province, because in the Ontario Human Rights Codes, that is quite literally against the law. You cannot be discriminated against after coming to your organization or your supervisor saying that I have this disability or this mental health illness that I'm struggling with, and therefore need accommodations, because organizations have a duty to accommodate, and they cannot fire you for simply coming clean or saying that you have this, you're struggling with this mental illness. So this is the second reason. Organizations should care because they have to, and it's illegal not to. So that's pretty compelling. But I'm going to tell you, the third reason is probably the most compelling one for organizations, which is the financial reason. So quite simply, organizations should care because it's cheaper to care. It's more cost-effective to care. So let me kind of break that down. Why it's
the previous point is quite black and white. It's in the law, and I think that applies to a specific case of it sounds like it applies to termination from your example.
Yes.
But it doesn't cover that. I think there's a bit more of a grayer area in like like that. There's a difference between doing the bare minimum, maybe not terminating, but like what about like giving people more resources, or like making sure that there's more attention put in the kind of culture that people want to create, right? Because like as if you're growing a young company, you can decide on like the culture can shape which directions it go to. It could be a more very like capitalistic, competitive, cutthroat kind of culture, and like there are companies out there that believe in that, versus like a more compassionate, empathetic approach. And I think both schools of thought exist in the world out there right now, and from a business financial standpoint, they, again, and I'm not citing like a research paper or anything, but just thinking of some examples of companies that have adopted each of those approaches, broadly speaking, and is still able to thrive in a business sense, if you're just looking at like numbers. So I guess the point here is that, or maybe this is a segue into your financial point, like how it makes financial sense for this. But I just want to put out that too, like that the idea of like for someone who's thinking of what kind of culture they want to create, like each of those, or maybe somewhere in the middle, like what is the right kind of culture. Anyways, I'm starting to digress a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. I absolutely agree with your point of that. Meeting the Ontario Human Rights Code is kind of just your bare minimum. Not firing somebody who has depression is really just your bare minimum. That's absolutely right. And the uncomfortable and unfortunate truth is that while an organization cannot fire, cannot discriminate against someone because they have a mental health issue, it doesn't mean that there aren't dozens of ways that they can make that person's life miserable.
Yeah.
So
that's
that
the theme of it. So let's explore the case of of like why and how organizations should care more about this and should invest more in this and should like even though there is no that there might it might not be required by law to go to, let's say, carve culture in a certain direction or like invest in certain kinds of supports and things like that. Like why would it be a good idea to do that?
Yeah. So I think that to truly understand that, and this ties into the whole financial point about why it's cheaper to care, we have to kind of roll back to the early part of our conversation where I talked about mental health and that everyone has mental health. Mm-hmm. So, as an organization...
Unless you're an organization that hires cyborgs.
Yeah, exactly. So it's that you can't kind of cherry pick your employees while you're doing screenings for hiring or whatever, saying, okay, you know what, this person is never going to have a mental health issue. That's why I want them on board. It doesn't work like that. I mean, first of all, that would be discrimination. But second of all, it doesn't work like that because anyone can have positive or negative mental health. Okay. So now, most of the time, somebody experiencing a mental health challenge isn't going to go from 0 to 100 overnight. While it's true that traumatic events might cause somebody to enter a state of crisis very quickly, in many cases, it's less of like a free fall and more like a gradual decline. Here's another thing. It's much, much easier for someone to bounce back if they're in the earlier stages as opposed to the later stages. Once somebody gets to a state of crisis, they might need more complex supports and more intensive care in order to return to baseline. In fact, there's an entire healthcare model built upon this premise. It's called the stepped care model. So stepped care is a system of delivering and monitoring mental health treatment so that the most effective but the least resource-intensive treatment is delivered first, and then only stepping up to more intensive specialist services as required. And so, depending on the level of patient distress or need. So let's look at the model, for example, and this is a 5-step model, but it could be 6 steps, 7 steps, 8 steps, depending on, because different organizations, different mental health institutions or healthcare institutions have kind of different steps in there.
The idea is that there's generally this sort of a practice of maybe I presume there's going to be like a form of triage and then
yes
steps.
Yes. So usually there's some sort of triaging or understanding what it is that the client needs. So, and that's where you kind of assess, where is the client at, what kind of supports do you need? So an example of kind of step 1 of that step care model would be prevention and health promotion. So it could be the kind of support that's used before approaching health or social services. So like friends and family, self-help groups, occupational advice, like help lines, in a lot of ways, these are super accessible things for a lot of people, that it doesn't require too much time or too many resources. It doesn't necessarily require you to take a step away from work in order to access those resources. So now let's say that you're a little bit further along the spectrum and step 1 doesn't really work for you anymore. So step 2, so that's maybe recognition in primary care. So that would be the kind of watchful waiting with further assessment. So it could be guided self-help. So the first step was self-help. The second step was guided self-help, where you do have somebody like a healthcare practitioner usually who's going to help guide you along the way. Or short-term brief interventions or kind of expert advice. It does require a professional third party.
A little bit more resource intensive. I get your point here. Is that mm-hmm. at every level it will start to, there'll be more care and with a bit more care, more attention, it will be more resource intensive.
Exactly, because like at the end of that step, at the highest level of the step is usually specialist care, and it's kind of assessment and treatment with inpatient services, like very more complex care with specialist interventions.
Okay.
So to bring it back to the workplace, we can see that somebody who's at step 1 is much more likely to be able to continue to stay at work and contribute productively while receiving that kind of support. Whereas at step 5, considering the high risk of relapse and intensive care needed, this person is going to be quite unlikely to be able to return to work in the short term. So what does that mean? to look at it another way as an organization. If your choice is between fostering a supportive, positive organizational culture where, from the leadership top down, it kind of you foster an environment that is very caring and open, and you openly discuss whether or not people are struggling or thriving, and so employees feel understood and supported at work, and that's your first choice. And then your second choice is you're losing valuable talent and expertise, as well as experiencing higher turnover rates, absenteeism, because you don't foster that positive organizational culture, which is a better decision financially.
There was a scandal that came out, I think sometime last year. I don't remember what the company is, but which company that was, but it was supposed to be it's a company whose empathy should obviously be like a core value. I think it's catered towards like their core customer base are expecting mothers or something like that. But they do come out of this tech and tech startup world and the VC world, which is also in some circles known to be quite intense. Maybe cutthroat can be the word. So in order to survive in that, they will need to do very desperate things like making people work super hard or long hours and burn them out. So that I think that's an example of a company that did that, but they got a lot of backlash because hey, here you're a company that's to your customers is supposed to be represent these values, but then to your employees, it's the way they treat them is completely different. So another example I can think of is Netflix. I think they're quite openly so. They've published their culture deck, which is very, very explicitly spelling out to employees and everyone else in the world that it's an up or out kind of culture. If they're not good enough, they describe it as if someone is not good enough, if you're not good enough, you will graduate from Netflix. In other words, fired. And then the idea there is that only people who are, in their words, high performing can remain. So yeah, that's one. I guess that's the other side of the spectrum. Of course, I didn't get to go deep into the effects of that, the impacts of that on their business. And again, that was a culture that was published a while ago, and I have no idea if they still practice that or not. But yeah,
it's an interesting point whereby it, to an outsider looking in, it can seem that, well, why are all these organizations who supposedly have this really toxic competitive workplace culture, why are they doing so well? Why are they like the top 10, top 50 companies in the world, if ostensibly the whole point that we're trying to make is that if your organization cares about its employees, then it will make the organization better. So I think what I have to offer in terms of that is to understand that some of these techniques might work out well in the short term for the organization, but if you're looking at long term, you're going to see a lot more systemic issues come into play, such as, for example, and this doesn't just apply to Netflix or any one of the organizations that you were talking about, but let's say generally, if in an organization you're fostering a culture of extreme competitiveness, that also means that you're not fostering a culture of collaboration. And well, what do we know about collaboration, right? Is that, a lot of really innovative, diverse ideas arise out of companies that foster collaboration. So, just to take that as like one example, that's one of the reasons why you want to probably try to create a positive, supportive work environment.
Better for the long run.
Yes.
Long story short. Okay. Cool. That's quite a bit to digest. So maybe it's so we're talking about like the organizational level, like what the organizational culture should be, but maybe there's an idea of like the broader culture maybe defined as such, but maybe on a more micro level, like individual teams operate differently. Like maybe this is the culture deck. This is how it is. It's going to be cutthroat. It's like, welcome to the company. It's going to be cutthroat. But when they actually meet their managers, they might be surprised to find that they have very compassionate, empathetic managers. And maybe that's a way to go with it. So, but anyways, the point is to segue into this idea of so what maybe if we zoom into the more like one level down to the teams level, how should leaders and people managers, bosses, balance this out, like the need to drive results versus the need to be compassionate and empathetic towards I said to balance, like as though I'm suggesting that there is a zero-sum game, but I highly suspect that you agree that it's not. Do you want to add some color to that before
what I believe is that those aren't actually competing interests, that it's actually one and the same, in that if you're trying to create that that healthy, supportive environment for your employees, it is the same as trying to create a productive environment where you're trying to meet your deliverables and trying to meet your goals. Actually, I'm just suddenly recalling a conversation that we had in the past, right? Where I think we talked about that whole
the same thing, right?
Yeah, we talked about that whole idea of empathy as a sort of problem-solving mechanism, where if you're, let's say, if you're a manager or supervisor, and maybe somebody on your team is perhaps falling behind of their goals or falling behind on their deliverables, maybe the better approach is to be able to do that active listening that I talked about, do that active listening and try to empathize with them and drill down to, well, what is really bothering them? And maybe you'll never be able to drill down to it, but the point is that the very fact that you've tried is going to foster that super positive relationship in your team with that employee that you have. So now they trust you more. And let's just say that, this is maybe something temporary that is happening in their personal life. That is why it's leading to them having to struggle at work. And eventually they pick up their efforts again and are able to, return back to where they were. But it does mean that even if you did nothing, because we're saying you didn't manage to discover what it was that was bothering them. So in some senses, what it would look like from the outside, that you had achieved nothing, but you didn't achieve nothing. What you did was you built that rapport with your team member or your employee, so that they're more likely to value the organization, value the work they're doing, feel like they have a sense of belonging in the organization. And once again, in the long run, they're more likely to be happy, productive employees. But it's kind of an interesting point you raise, in that quite a lot of the driving force behind creating positive organizational culture does fall at the leadership and management levels. In an organizational culture, is quite simply top down, and it's not as effective unless you have leaders that walk the walk and not just talk the talk, right? Mm-hmm. So what is kind of important here for a lot of organizations is to have that training, have that education for people at the management and leadership levels on how do we build these healthy teams, which is actually something that we do at the Canadian Mental Health Association, where we have a program called Mental Health Works, and we do workshops on how do you address stress in the workplace, or mood and depression in the workplace with your employees, and that kind of thing.
So I was wondering if I want to go deeper into. I think it's been over an hour, but they're still quite.
I mean, honestly, obviously this is an area that I'm super passionate about, because I'm working in the sector. So we could talk about this for 8 hours, and I would still have more to talk about. But I'm willing to bet that people listening to this podcast don't have 8 hours to listen to me.
So switching into a more technical gear, what tips would you share about? I think I'll ask it as a two-part thing. Like, one part would be what tips would you share to leaders and bosses to be able to do this well? And then second one is like how can people treat their tips for how people think about this in terms of them and their peers.
Think about this as in mental health at work.
Yes. Yeah. And also tying into the previous conversation about compassion, or we can talk about it, empathy, or we can talk about it in a broader sense too.
Yeah, so on the managerial side, the leadership side, I think first of all is the recognition that your leadership really matters. So there's quite a lot of interesting research out there which shows that burnout at work, more often than not, the biggest driving force in people feeling burnout at work is actually not where they work or what they do at work, but who they work for. So whether they're managers, managerial styles, or what are their leaders like. Mm-hmm. So to kind of so in terms of practical tips and how do you understand this, I think the first thing is really education, really, that I truly believe that there's always room for anyone to learn and educate themselves more about mental health and kind of creating that positive environment. So I would pull some of the strategies from the Mental Health Works program that I mentioned earlier, which is they have a 3-step approach to addressing mental health in the workplace. So the first one is intentional noticing. So what that means is if you're a manager, supervisor, it means paying attention to your team. It means paying attention to your employees and noticing if they might be behaving differently, speaking differently, appearing differently from their baseline. So what this means is that, let's say you're a great manager, you're a great supervisor, you have wonderful relationships with your employees. This means that you are paying attention to them on a personal level. You might notice that Joseph had a haircut the other day, or Pratik's wearing a new pair of shoes, simply because you have that level of rapport with your employees and you know about them and you have that close relationship with them. So let's just say there comes a day when you're noticing for long stretches of time that Joseph, was that the name I used? Yeah, Joseph, who had the new haircut. Let's just say, Joseph, this guy from your team, he's usually super well put together. He's like clean shaven. He has his hair all styled up and everything. And that's his baseline, because you worked with him for 3 years and you notice that this is what he's usually like. Great. But then there comes a time where it's maybe like 2 or 3 weeks and Joseph is showing up to the workplace and he's got the ketchup stains on his shirt, or maybe he's, not styling his hair the way he usually is. He's not clean shaven anymore. So what this indicates is that this is a difference. This is a difference from Joseph's baseline. So that's the first step. As a manager, you're having that intentional noticing. You're noticing when your employees are in some ways different from before. It could be now in many times, in fact, it could be absolutely nothing. It could be that Joseph has ketchup stains on his shirt because he had a baby. He and his wife had a baby, and he's sleeping maybe 2 hours every night collectively. So yeah, his head's not really in the right space. He doesn't really have time to shave in the morning or dry clean his shirts, and that's all it is. And he's not really struggling in any sense of the way, other than, of course, having a newborn is extremely difficult. Now, the second step of it, and which is really important, is the active listening portion, because that's what ties in the intentional noticing together with actually taking action. Because so you've noticed that with Joseph, with all the ketchup stains and the unkept hair and all that, so you have the active listening. You go to Joseph and you say, hey man, how are you doing lately? Is everything good with you? And there's I could talk and go on to super minute details of setting the stage for that conversation, the context for that conversation, your body language when you're having that conversation, because it's super important as a manager or supervisor that you're not making your employee feel like they're about to get into trouble. Because, for example, if your manager came into your office, slammed open the door and say, Joseph, we need to talk.
Oh, it's okay.
Exactly. It's like, Joseph, we need to talk about your behavior. Joseph's gonna have a heart attack.
Yeah.
Versus, like on a lunch break or something, you come into his workspace and you say, "Hey Joseph, how are you doing? How was your weekend? Like, is everything okay with you?" And kind of letting that conversation flow from there. There's a huge difference in how you're setting that stage. So depending on how the active listening of that portion goes, again, remembering that you're not there to offer solutions, because Joseph doesn't want your solutions yet. You're just there as a space you're almost like a detective. Think of it as you're being a detective right now. You're trying to see what's underneath the surface. And, this Joseph who is not shaven right now, what's going on inside his head, what's going on in his, maybe personal life or even his work life. Is there something that's happening in the workspace, like workplace bullying, harassment, that is making him feel this way? So this is where you really have to listen to what he's talking about. Because on the one hand, he might say, yeah, I have a newborn and I love my kids so much, but it's really hard to get sleep at night. Or he might say something like, recently I haven't felt comfortable in the workplace because there have been some really toxic behaviors by so-and-so. It really depends. He might go either way. And your job as a supervisor or a manager is to just listen to him.
Like in the spirit of that, like suspend judgment, suspend the urge to want to say anything, or like to truly listen. So I guess without going into the like too deep in that thing, I guess the two things to look up and dig deeper into this: active listening and intentional noticing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's intentional noticing first, then active listening. And then you finally come to the third step, which is the final step of working together. So that's your problem-solving stage. And notice that I say working together, not giving advice. Because the whole point of that final stage of it is, you've noticed that something might be happening with Joseph. Mm-hmm. You've listened to him to understand what is this thing that's affecting him. And then finally, you're going to let him take the lead on what kinds of accommodations or what kind of supports he might need. Because let's just say the issue is that he's not having a lot of sleep lately because his kid was just born. Then maybe the accommodation in that case, Joseph might say, maybe I could use my vacation days now. He needs a break, or maybe he needs to take a longer paternal leave or something, right? But let's just say the issue is, toxic workplace behavior. Joseph might say, I need you to intervene on my behalf. And so but you're not going to know which one it is and what solution or what accommodation Joseph needs unless you're letting him take the lead on that discussion and saying, and really your role as the listener or a manager is to be, I'm here for you, I have your back, and we're going to solve this issue together. Now, so a question that comes up is that, well, as a manager, supervisor, I can't solve Joseph's personal life problems. Correct. You cannot solve his personal problems at home or in life or whatever. However, you can make it such that the workplace and, the duties or responsibilities that he has at work make it easier for him to be able to go home, deal with whatever it is that's happening at home, and then come back to work refreshed and ready to start the day as a healthy, productive employee again. Mm-hmm. So that's a very, very, very long-winded answer to your tips for managers or supervisors.
Good. I feel like it's not just applies to tech, it applies broadly, which is great. That's fantastic actually. So
I super recommend the Mental Health Works program. They do put out a lot of webinars usually that are, I think lately, especially with the COVID situation. So if you look up Mental Health Works webinars, they have kind of a lot of free resources out there for people to use as well.
Okay. Mental Health Works. It's quite hard to forget that name. It's quite. I see what you all did there with the.
Quite catchy, huh? It's quite catchy. Yeah.
So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to kind of on the employee side and how you conduct those conversations is one of it is, well, it's hard to split those two out actually though, because a lot of how employees are going to behave and react in the organization depends so much upon that organizational culture or upon what is the behavior of leadership, right? So it's very hard to say you should advocate for yourself, you should ask for accommodations if the organizational culture is not receptive to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a stepped process whereby if the organizational culture in the company is one that is open, is one that is supportive, then as an employee, then you absolutely shouldn't be afraid to speak out and ask for those accommodations and start a dialogue with your manager, your supervisor, or even your other colleagues, because don't forget that people on your team, your colleagues, can also be a source of support. But if we're talking about, general mental health tips and all that, then I think, we've gone into a couple of those, like, anxiety and grounding tips. And I'm just going to kind of leave with that. But if you go onto the CMHA website, the Canadian Mental Health Association website, there's a ton of resources over there. And like, there's a program called Bounce Back, which is essentially a free self-help program that you can receive telephone coaching, skill building workshops. You do have to be referred by your primary health providers, which is like a doctor or a nurse, but it's absolutely free. So, we exist as an organization to help people, and there's tons of free resources, so make use of that.
Awesome. Bounce Back and mental health works.
Yeah. Take away, but also just check out the website, because we do have a lot of resources, tip sheets, that kind of thing on how to manage your stress, anxiety, general mental health tips and coping, especially during this time.
Can you try the cause of this conversation if you've seen the sunset?
Yeah, I feel like it's getting darker and darker. I'm like, should I turn on my desk lamp?
Yeah, I mean, always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, again, it can go on forever as always. Anyways, I'll give you the soapbox to have your picture or your spiel or your shout outs, anything before.
Yes. So I think that, if there's kind of just one thing that I want to close with is just, that recognition that mental health is important, which, seems really trite for me to say this after having this super long conversation about why we should care about mental health and all that. But really, it's that your mental health is important, is just as important as your physical health. It's not, in fact, it's intertwined with your physical health, but that's like a whole other conversation about how physical health affects mental health and all that. And then this is going to turn into like an 8-hour long podcast.
Part 2 of this.
Yeah. So I think my takeaway is that your mental health is important, number one. And number two is that there are resources, organizations, people out there to support you, especially during this super difficult time. So I hope that nobody ever feels like they're alone or that they're struggling in this by themselves.
Well said. So I guess, yeah, on that note, thanks for watching and listening. You can check out this podcast and more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on our YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thank you, Pearlyn, for joining. It's been a pleasure. And this is the First Name Basis Remote Edition. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.